And I said, what's going on? He said, I saw the invitation. It said cocktail attire. He said, it said dressed up, but this dressed up to me. And I said, okay, that's fine. And I said, I shook his hand and kept on moving. As I thought about that, in our relationship to God and our commitment to God, we have to sometimes ask ourselves, as we read the invitation, do we jumble God's ensemble? The things that God has assigned us to do, like this. Does our thinking and our talking match the message that God has proclaimed in our lives? Does what I communicate match my commitment to God? I noticed that throughout the reunion and all the attendees there, everyone had on cocktail attire. They were dressed up, but this brother had on what I like to call Oxtail attire. I'll explain that. For those of us who know what Oxtail is, it is a Southern comfort classic that has been made popular through soul food. It is a meaty, bone-in dish that is stewed in the pot. You put it on the plate and you take that meat, and it just does wonders and things in our community. Because many people love oxtail. In my own mind, I like to look at oxtail as country food. Everyone else in there had on cocktail attire, and he had on what I like to call oxtail attire. He just didn't match. He was just a little country for what we were trying to do that night. And when you think about it, my indication in life ought to be what I do in life. There ought to be an indication that I received God's invitation. So what we're going to look at, we have journeyed to 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 11. We just want to talk about cocktail, not oxtail. Look at your neighbor real fast and say, neighbor. Cocktail, not oxtail. There ought to be a way we ought to be living. That's what we're going to talk about. Cocktail, not oxtail. If we're going to look at this, there are two things that I want to pull from this one verse to help us understand how do we go about maturing in life, receive the blessing of God, but living a life that looks like I actually have some communication with God. In verse 11, Paul says, when I was a child, I spoke and thought and reasoned as a child. The first thing I want to show us is the occasion. Everybody say occasion. There's an occasion, not only in the text, but there's an occasion in our lives. From the moment that we were born, we all received an invitation to live life. And as we receive this invitation to live life, this invitation to live life says that we will take the course of life, even though life may be coarse sometimes. There may be some things that we have to go through in life, but when we were born, we received that invitation. And the fact that we're still in this course of life means that we still have accepted the invitation. And when we look at what we're talking about, there's a great occasion. An occasion is a circumstance or a particular time that has been set. In 1 Corinthians chapter 13, it is known as the love passage. Because the Apostle Paul talks about love, and he talks about, first of all, how love comes into our lives and our hearts, and he talks about how he can speak with tongues of men and of angels and all these things, but if he doesn't have love, he's sounding brass and tingling cymbal. He talks about all these things. He says that love ought to have something that ought to contribute. What can we contribute? But then he says love ought to have an attribute. He says love is patient, love is kind, love does not, puff itself up. Goes through all these things about love. And as we look at this, the only reason why he's speaking these things about love, because at the close of 1 Corinthians chapter 12, he says, I shall show you a more excellent way. In the church of Corinth and in our lives, there are people who get caught up in spiritual gifts. There are people who get caught up in trying to outdo each other. And the whole issue of tongues had come up, and Paul had to put that thing to rest and put that to bed and let everybody know it doesn't matter how many spiritual gifts you have, how you can sing and run and shout and do all this stuff. If we don't have love, we don't have anything. And he says it's not just having love, but executing love, because love is an action word. We ought to be showing love on a daily basis. So as he talks about how if he has all these gifts and doesn't have love, it doesn't mean anything. But then he talks about what love is and all the attributes of love. But then he says, when I was a child, I spoke, thought, and reasoned as a child. We need to look back on our lives and realize and understand that the Lord is trying to mature us in the body of Christ. What sense would it make to go to church Sunday after Sunday, month in and month out, and still never have any spiritual maturity? I tell people this all the time. You might not cuss like you used to, but at least you don't curse. You understand what I mean? It ought to be some words that your vocabulary ought to just lighten up just a little bit. You used to, and I'm not trying to call it about, you probably used to do a keg, now you just may be down to a 6-pack.